Good afternoon, everybody. Welcome to RUSI, those of you who are here, and welcome to all of you online. My name is Tom Keating. I'm director of our Centre for Financial Crime and Security Studies here at the Institute. And it's really a huge pleasure to invite you all to this afternoon's event and to welcome Oliver Bullough, who is going to discuss his new book, Butler to the World. In fact, it could hardly be newer, I think. I'm not sure when it started selling, but last Thursday. Okay, so we're in the first week, which I think is still new. And although the book is new, of course, the issues that it explores are certainly not. And in fact, they are deep-seated and central to much of what the UK is today, and indeed to many of the great tragedies in the world, from poverty and failing services in distant lands to the war that is happening right here in Europe at the moment in Ukraine. So Oliver and I first met when I was trying to figure out my post-investment banking career, and I hope that he'll agree that he was too at that time in 2014, trying to figure out what to make of the illicit finance rabbit hole that he appeared to have been drawn into in the aftermath of the Maidan revolution in Ukraine in 2014. And since then, we've both been on a parallel journey that have, I'm pleased to say, regularly intersected at events. We both gave evidence in the Foreign Affairs Committee together 2 or 3 years ago, no doubt about more of which in due course. Webinars, windowless rooms in Whitehall, all that sort of stuff. And so it's great to have the opportunity to host him here at RUSI today. And of course, in that time, Oliver has now published his second book, which makes me feel like a complete loser because I haven't even published one yet, even though we've been on a similar journey. So over the next hour, we're going to hear from Oliver about his new book, the characters he met, the Jeevesian wheezes that the UK has deployed over decades of financial services adaptation, 75 years, I think, probably. So 3/4 of a century of these high financial jinx. But it's also important to recognize that we sit here at a time when the UK government has been forced to confront its butlering or buttling role in the world. Something it has long resisted. Repeated governments, I should say, have long resisted. And that is only because of the invasion by Vladimir Putin of Ukraine. So we'll get to that point and discussion of the new Economic Crime Act in the second half, at which point we'll draw on the expertise and experience of my colleague Helena Wood, who's a senior research fellow here in our program and co-leads our UK economic crime work. But before we start, and bearing in mind that there are many of you joining us online, for which thanks, sort of usual rules apply. Do please put your questions in the Q&A box and I will answer them as they come up here. And we have a mic for passing around the room here for questions. Do please wait for the mic so that those online can hear what is going on. I won't bore you with any advertising about our program. You can find us very easily on the RUSI website. And if you are going to tweet about the event, then do please use the hashtag Butler to the World, which is what it says on the back of the book that Oliver kindly gave me. So with all that said, I'm going to now welcome Oliver again. Thank you very much for being with us. And I'm going to start, if I may, with a really simple question. Start with the beginning, start with the cover. Tell us about the title, about the inspiration and what it means.
Yeah, thanks, Tom. Thanks everyone for being here and for people watching online. It's very entertaining in a way how Tom and my career in this particular area started. I think probably both of us, perhaps slightly driven by what was happening in Ukraine in 2014, and it's interesting in a way. It seems to have become slightly full circle that now a lot of the debate about it, this is again being driven by events in Ukraine. Ukraine seems to be at the center of the kleptocracy story. In Ukraine in 2014 became very interested by corruption because corruption was one of the, if not the primary drivers of the anger among revolutionaries. And it took about less than a day to do any research into corruption in Ukraine to realize that you couldn't understand corruption in Ukraine without understanding the enabling role of the UK in particular, and London, I suppose. And so that became the focus of what I did, trying to work out how kleptocracy works between countries, and this. So I've written more about financial crime and kleptocracy over the last 8 years. Became a general theme that whatever the scam, whatever the scheme, whatever was happening, the UK always has a role. It might be that Our shell companies are central to the laundering of money via Danske Bank or Swedbank or ABLV or whatever the big money laundering scandals of Eastern Europe. It might be that our shell companies are helping to hide wealth stolen from Nigeria or Angola or wherever. It might be that our lawyers are helping to settle the business disputes of oligarchs because they've so destroyed the courts in their own countries that they use ours. Or it might be that our lawyers are helping to censor journalists in this country to make sure that the secrets of oligarchs are not exposed. Britain is always at the center of what's happening. And I suppose I'd sort of slightly taken that for granted, really. I didn't really think of that as weird. It was just something, it was in the background of how kleptocracy works. Britain is part of it. But I had this very interesting conversation with an American academic called Andrew, who was writing about Chinese money laundering in particular, which is obviously as a London nexus because everything always does. And he took me out for a cup of coffee, actually just near here in the cafe in Waterstones on Trafalgar Square, 4 years ago maybe. And because I ran these kleptocracy tours, was part of the team that ran the kleptocracy tours in West London, pointing out houses that belong to kleptocrats, in money, one of which was, of course, occupied by squatters yesterday. And the police paid far more attention to the squatters having occupied it than they ever paid to the fact that it got bought in the first place. But that is a different story. And so Andrew took me out for coffee, and he wanted to know, essentially he was trying to gain context for the kind of people in America who do work against kleptocracy. You know, who's the equivalent of the Southern District of New York? Who's the equivalent of the kleptocracy department in the Department of Justice? Who's the equivalent of Homeland Security investigations? You know, and every time he asked me, I had to tell him that I couldn't help him. And I think he thought that I was holding out on him and just not sharing my contact book. And eventually I really was, I wasn't getting across to him that it wasn't that I wasn't prepared to tell him who these people were, that these people didn't exist. There were no people doing the work that he was asking me about. And eventually I was to say, look, you can understand it. It's you're asking me about something that isn't happening. In America, you're like the policeman to the world, but and then I was trying to come up with if we're not the policeman to the world, what are we? So, well, we're like the butler to the world. You know, if someone with money wants something done, we do it, whatever it is. And I think he thought I don't think he thought I was being serious. So he went off to find other people to talk to who might be more helpful. But actually, he was sitting there and thinking, actually, it's quite a useful way of formulating it. Someone called it a couple of days ago, Dark Jeeves, which isn't my form. I'm a bit annoyed about because it's very good, Dark Jeeves. It's a bit like being a consigliere, but a consigliere is a bit sort of rough, or ill-mannered perhaps. Whereas Butler's impeccable. You're well-dressed, you glide in, you speak with the right accent, you could quote Marcus Aurelius, you can do everything that's required. It's very polite, but at the same time, particularly if you read the Jeeves and Worcester stories, what Jeeves does is pretty grim, really. Like if you take away the jokes and the light tone, actually he's kind of sordid. There's one story when he knocks out a police officer to get Bertie out of trouble. There's another one when he bribes a police officer, or rather he says, no, sir, I didn't bribe him. I merely gave him a little present, which is very much the kind of thing I've heard people in Ukraine say about how they've approached police officers. And it's that formulation of Britain as a butler, just sorting out the problems of anyone rich enough, I found very helpful is to understand why Britain does what it does. And so that's the story I set out to tell. And inevitably then, that takes you into the birth of offshore finance and when the butlering business begins, which is, as you say, so 75 odd years ago, right here in the city. Well, in the city, not right here, but just down the road in the city, and the birth of the post-imperial destiny of the UK. There's this line, Dean Acheson line, former Secretary of State, that Britain's lost an empire, has not yet found a role, which he said in 1962, and he meant it as a throwaway remark. He didn't mean it to be such a kind of pointed barb to the heart of Britain's, post-imperial pride, which it turned out to be. But actually, it was ironic because Britain had already found a role. The offshore markets had existed for 6 good years by then. It's just no one had noticed.
So one of the themes, one of the things that any good Jeeves is good at doing is being creative. And I think creativity and financial creativity is one of the themes that comes up through the book. How have these butlering services helped the UK financial sector survive and thrive? So there are 2, I think, stories that are really good examples of that. And the first one we have to talk about, because you and I have both been there, so we can talk about the hijinks we got up to. But the BVI. So BVI. Tell the story about the BVI, because I think everyone has heard about the BVI. The BVI appears in newspaper stories and various papers beginning with P, as we were talking about earlier on. So how did that British overseas territory get to where it is today? Why is that such a good example of the Butler to the world?
So the British Virgin Islands are quite, I mean, they're famous, notorious now, infamous, because of multiple corruption scandals. There is often a BVI nexus. But what's interesting, looking at the history of the BVI, if you look them up in Hansard, when they were referred to in Parliament, until the 1960s, the only references to the British Virgin Islands I could find in Hansard would be when someone would say something about the British Virgin Islands, and then someone would always tell a joke about, where are the British Virgin Islands? Well, they must be far from the Isle of Man. That's literally, like, it was, parliamentarians could not get enough of that gag. And it just, I mean, it's a demonstration of the supreme, as it were, unimportance of the British Virgin Islands, that they were never referred to in any other context. Because, sometimes they would be referred to as just a list of overseas territories, and that would be how someone would pick them out, to have the opportunity to tell that hilarious joke. And it was an incredibly a backwater of backwaters in the British Empire. It was one of the Caribbean territories that was put on the path to independence last, because it was very, very poor, referred to by one colonial official as the most backward possession of the British colonial empire, which, considering how big the empire was, is quite an amazing thing. Up into the 1970s, it was only then gaining autonomy, the kind of autonomy by which point a place like Jamaica and Guyana had obviously already become independent. A lot of the Caribbean had already become independent. And it really needed to find a way to earn a living. It had no real economy, subsistence agriculture, trading into the US Virgin Islands next door, but that was about it. But at the time, there were American lawyers looking for ways for their clients to dodge taxes. Taxes in the US and all over the world were very high at the time, and US lawyers tended to route money via Curacao, the Dutch possession off the coast of Venezuela. But the annoying thing about Dutch possessions is they speak Dutch, and that meant court proceedings were in Dutch, and it was annoying. So they were looking for an English-speaking equivalent to Curacao, and rang up the legal practice in the British Virgin Islands, where they found Michael Regals, who is a Tanzanian or Tanganyika raised lawyer who'd left Tanzania when it started going quite Maoist in the 60s, ended up in the British Virgin Islands doing kind of motor claims, territorial disputes between neighbors, really bog standard legal stuff. And then he was rung up by a lawyer from New York saying, we need a company to do some tax straddles. And so, fine, we can do that for you. Yes, sir. Very good, sir. And they did that. And it became a sort of a mildly profitable sideshow for the BVI. And the BVI started, selling quite a number of shell companies for American lawyers to help their clients dodge taxes. But then, the American government quite naturally got annoyed about this and cancelled their double taxation treaty between them. So these shell companies were no longer of any use to anyone. And the BVI was confronting this loss of revenue, which they got quite used to. It was not a place with revenue, and suddenly having some form of revenue to the government, apart from selling postage stamps, was a useful thing. And the lawyer called back and said, well, that's a problem, but we can help that. Let's write a new law. Let's write a new law which will create a new form of shell company, which will be even better than the old one. And it's, we often talk about lobbying between governments. This was the most incredible demonstration of way past lobbying. This law was written by the three lawyers in the British Virgin Islands, the Attorney General of the British Virgin Islands, and the American law firm all together wrote the law. There's no way of saying where one bit started and the other one stopped. They all wrote it together, faxed it backwards and forwards. Actually, the US law firm sent a word processor to the BVI, the first computer on the islands, in order so that it was the local secretaries who had to do the typing rather than the ones in New York, because they were getting fed up with it. And having created this law, which was done totally at the request of this American law firm, the International Business Corporation, the IBC, is sort of pushed out into the world, where it immediately, or almost immediately, catches the attention of all the mafiosi who'd just been kicked out of Panama when Noriega was overthrown. And they're like, oh, look, this is useful. This is like Panama, but even better. And then when Britain said that Hong Kong was going to be returned to mainland Chinese control, all the Chinese businessmen needed a place to put their property that wasn't Hong Kong. And so suddenly all the Chinese people came along, and they were so desperate to get Chinese attention that they, on the 8th of August 1988, the luckiest day of the Chinese century, because 8 is considered a lucky number in Chinese superstition, certainly in Hong Kong, superstition. Even though everything was shut for Emancipation Day in the British Virgin Islands, they remained open so they could incorporate hundreds and hundreds and hundreds of companies on 88 to make them super lucky for the Chinese clientele. Everything was available. And the BVI became the supreme expression of the shell company haven. It's the place that does it best, does it cheapest, does it most efficiently. And it was this, I spoke to Michael Regals. He's still alive. He's very, I mean, did you meet him as well?
Yeah,
Delightful old guy. Lives in this, he's retired now. It's this fabulous house with a view over the Drake Channel, over towards I suppose, eventually towards Spain, but a long way away. He's very happy with his lot. He had this great line. He said, yes, because he did spend a little bit of time in Britain between Tanzania and BVI, absolutely hated it in the 1970s. It's just very funny about it. It says, yeah, I could have stayed in Britain and I'd be there, living in a small house in, I don't know, Ham or something, bitching about Brexit. And yet now I'm here. And he's got this huge villa looking down with a view over the Caribbean. And you're like, yeah, he did well out of it. And the British Virgin Islands did very well out of it. I mean, it is now, the average living standards in the BVI is higher than it is in Western Europe on average. It was a place that existed on subsistence agriculture. Now it has all the food is imported. It has all the cars are big, boxy American cars. It is a prosperous place. It's lovely. It's a very nice country, but the entire place, the prosperity of the whole country is based on the sale of shell companies. And that's what I call butlering, on essentially solving foreigners' problems. Because shell companies are no good to people in the BVI. They are totally useless and unhelpful to anyone in the BVI. They're only helpful for projecting the laws of the BVI into a foreign country. And ironically, in considering where Michael Regals came from, they have been astonishingly detrimental to Tanzania. Tanzania, as a result, has suffered from corruption scandal after corruption scandal, all enabled out of the BVI. Though interestingly, when I asked him about it, he said he never heard of them. So there you go.
Well, I think we'll come back to that because it's often said that financial crime is a victimless crime, but I think there are lots of examples and plenty of examples in the book which knock that on the head. Now, I was going to dive into the euro-dollar market, but that's only because I'm a former investment banker, and I decided when I was thinking up the questions for this that actually it's going to be of interest to only one person in the room. That's me. So, or maybe you, two people in the room. So
I can't get enough of the euro-dollar market.
Well, so we're going to now turn, if we can, close to home to Scotland, and in particular Scottish limited partnerships. So I think what I find striking about the book is like so many of these sort of butlering tools have like remarkably boring sounding names, innocuous sounding titles, and actually quite often started life as quite a benign tool. I mean, Scottish limited partnerships being a case in point, but as the book obviously demonstrates, once kind of big and unscrupulous Jeeves-like brains get involved, then the original purpose gets perverted. So tell us about Scotland's role in all of this, because that's a much more recent problem.
I think, it's interesting you say that about these tools. Often, I think partly because of the British Constitutional Convention of just laying new layers of straw on top of things without mucking out the old ones, that you end up with all these kind of legal instruments just left lying around, which are more or less defunct, but they're still there and can still be revived. And the Scottish Limited Partnership is kind of the perfect example of that. Limited partnerships were brought in 1906, was it, 1907, as a tool, kind of because there was worries that maybe they had them in France and we needed them here. It was so we were being left behind by financial innovation. They were never really amounted to anything. But because of the difference in Scots law and English and Welsh law, a Scottish limited partnership is slightly different to an otherwise limited partnership, with the crucial distinction that it is essentially has corporate sort of. It is a corporation, essentially. It can own property. It can own a bank account, unlike a normal partnership, which is just the sort of commonality of its partners added together. A Scottish one is its own corporate entity, which gives it a sort of quite a useful role if you're looking to own property with it or do some kind of business with it. And so they had this very, very niche, incredibly niche, ludicrously niche role in Scottish agricultural tenancies throughout the 20th century. They were used, essentially, that was their only role. And then some sort of financial genius at some point in the 1990s was kind of leafing through an old textbook of partnership law and was like, what is this Scottish limited partnership? What's that for? And realized it's extremely useful place for holding bank accounts. And the fact that if a Scottish limited partnership's partners are companies registered in tax havens, it is as opaque as a company registered in a tax haven, except it's Scottish. So it doesn't look like a Seychelles shell company. It looks like a Scottish limited partnership, which sounds the kind of, I mean, it just sounds great, right? It's like, it's got that whole sort of
granite sense.
Exactly, you know, like a Bank of Edinburgh back in the day before the RBS scandal, when a Bank of Edinburgh was the most dependable thing you could imagine. And they boomed. I mean, if you look at the incorporation numbers for SLPs, there were more being incorporated every year by sort of 2006 than had been incorporated in the whole previous century. There were so many of them being created. And they featured in all of the big money laundering scandals out of Eastern Europe. You know, hundreds of billions of euros being moved out of the former Soviet Union, primarily out of Russia, but also out of Azerbaijan, out of Ukraine, out of Kazakhstan, and flooding into the Western financial system in huge quantities. And essentially, I mean, we know most about the Danske Bank scandal, which is the most well exposed. Essentially, what the bankers in Tallinn were doing was attaching a bank account in their branch in Tallinn to a Scottish limited partnership and selling it as a unit. And it worked like a Swiss bank account in its prime, in that the secret of the ownership of the bank account was between the banker and the client. The bank itself didn't know who owned the bank account. It was just between the banker and the client. And so, you know, it became astonishingly profitable for those bankers. It was very profitable for the people, well, relatively profitable for the people creating the SLPs, not that profitable. It's not like they were very expensive, but also incredibly bad for the countries of Eastern Europe. And this really came to a head in 2014 when there was this big scandal in Moldova when about $1 billion vanished from the Moldovan banking system. It's about 15% of Moldovan GDP, like a colossal hole in the country's balance sheet. And the investigation into this, conducted by Kroll Investigative Agency, pinpointed the central role that SLPs played in this. And that became known to Police Scotland. And Police Scotland were like, what on earth? And they looked at it, and this is incredible, and handed it to David Leask, who is a journalist at the Herald. And he wrote an article about it, which then came to the attention of Scottish politicians. Long story short, they decided that this is a loophole that needed closing. You know, the Scottish National Party were at that point doing very well. It's a loophole that needed closing, but they needed to close it in Westminster. And it's a story which, because I knew about SLPs before I sat down to write the book. I researched this during lockdown, but the subsequent, the secondary story of what happened when they go to Westminster, to the Parliament in Westminster, they had committee hearings. They brought David Leask down and Richard Smith, who'd also done some work into the role of SLPs in money laundering. They exposed everything. Like, everything was known in Parliament, and then the government did the opposite. It's the amazing thing. They didn't. Not only did they not regulate limited partnerships, they deregulated them further. So they created the private fund limited partnership, which is even less regulated than a limited partnership. And in fact, because of the peculiarities of Scots law, that means there is such a thing as a Scottish private fund limited partnership, which makes a Scottish limited partnership look, positively well regulated. It's absolutely extraordinary. And Roger Mullin, who was at the time the Treasury spokesman for the SNP, he couldn't believe it. He'd been making such a noise about this scandal every opportunity he had. And he said to the Treasury official who came in to speak to him, what's going on? You're not going to clamp down? And she said, no, the aim is absolutely not to clamp down. This is about securing the competitiveness of the City of London. And the thing that he didn't know, the thing that no one knew, is that money launderers weren't actually the people who discovered the amazing utility of a Scottish limited partnership. That was discovered by the private fund industry. And actually, money launderers were relatively small when it came to moving money through SLPs. And the concern was not that SLPs were being used to loot Moldova and loot Azerbaijan and loot Russia and so on. The concern was that if we regulated them further, the private fund industry would move to Luxembourg, and then we would lose all of that money, lovely money, which is currently registered in Mayfair. And that was the concern. So it's really, that story, to be honest, of all the stories in the book, it's one of the most depressing and most indicative of this intense desire to service money and the owners of money over and totally ignore the victims of financial criminals. One thing that's a subsidiary story to this is actually, there's a friend of mine who runs a charity raising money for orphanages in Moldova. And she asked me to speak online during lockdown at an event that they were doing to raise money for some of their events. And it's a very sort of high-toned clientele at this charity. She's got very good contacts. And I did this talk, and I told this story about how the private fund limited partnership had been created. And one of the people listening chipped in and said that's rubbish. That never happened. And I said, no. And he said, no, I was in the government at the time. I would have known if that had happened. And I said, no, it did. And I laid out how it happened and all the, the different legislative reform order that was brought in and the dates and everything. And it was just this really long pause. And he goes, that's bloody awful. And he was in the government at the time and he didn't know this had happened. It's so amazing the way this sort of almost happened on autopilot.
Yeah, well, talking of depressing things, there is, of course, one chapter in the book which deals with something which, when you wrote the book, had not started to happen, but of course is now happening on the border of Europe, and that is the war in Ukraine. And obviously we see the bombed out cities, we see the victims in European railway stations, tragically every day. And here's a question that I never thought I would get to ask, but how is a disused tube station in West London connected with what is going on in Ukraine at the moment?
It's the tube station. I actually popped down there yesterday to check if anything had happened to it. It hasn't. It's still there, unchanged. The tube station is the sort of culminating shameful episode in this remarkable demonstration of how open Britain is to any money. The origin, there are many origins to what's happening in Ukraine at the moment, but one of the key moments in modern Ukrainian history was in 2004 when they had what's called the Orange Revolution. The Orange Revolution, Putin had heavily backed one candidate for the presidency in Ukraine. There was another more pro-Western candidate. They're both called Victor, confusingly at the time. But they tried to, someone, presumably the Russians, tried to kill Viktor Yushchenko with dioxin. He became terribly disfigured. And he lost the election, but there were huge protests. I mean, I was there at the time. It was astonishing. The size of the protests, just relentless, weeks after weeks after weeks. And eventually the Supreme Court cancelled the election, reheld the election. Yushchenko wins, Yanukovych lost, and Putin was humiliated. And Putin doesn't take being humiliated very well as a rule. He brooded in his tower and decided to make his point to Ukraine by essentially doubling the price that Ukraine had to pay for gas. And Ukraine didn't buy gas directly from Gazprom. It bought gas via an intermediary called Rostukhnenergo, which is half owned by Gazprom and half owned by someone. It was the trust that the shares were held in trust by Raiffeisen Bank in Vienna. It wasn't clear who it was, who the person was. But when the deal was imposed on Russia, on Ukraine, the Ukrainian government tried to refuse to pay. The Russians cut the gas off. Essentially, the Ukrainian government had to back down. It destroyed the coalition that had won the revolution. Yanukovych got to come back as prime minister. And so the whole train of sort of misery and corruption, which is leading up to where we are now, begins with this, the destruction of the Orange Coalition in 2006. So it became a matter of intense interest to a lot of people. Who was it who held the other half of the shares in Rostukhnenergo? You know, what Gazprom and Putin had one half, who was the person who owned the other half? And it became clear quite quickly that it was a man called Dmitry Firtash, a Ukrainian businessman, very little known. At the time, so little known, there wasn't even a photograph of him. In the Global Witness did a report, they couldn't find a photo of him. But he did very well, billions and billions out of this particular transaction, needed someone to spend his money. Where do you take your money? Of course, you bring your money to London. So that was, so he first arrived here in about 2007. Within 7 years, he had bought himself a mansion in Knightsbridge, very nice mansion, by the way, built by the developer Mike Spink. He had set up the British Ukrainian Society, had members of the House of Lords and the House of Commons on his on the sort of coordinating board. He was a member of the Guild of Benefactors at Cambridge University, had been given a special medal by the university for his generosity, had got to meet Prince Philip, who was inducted him into the guild, his wife as well, also inducted. He met John Bercow, Speaker of the House of Commons, had opened trading in the London Stock Exchange. This is a guy who years previously had been so obscure no one even knew who he was at all. And then in 2014, when the crisis in Ukraine is brewing, he was brought in by the Foreign Office to advise them. How do we deal with Putin? What does this mean? You know, Putin's man in Ukraine advising the Foreign Office on how to deal with Putin. And then the Ministry of Defense sold him a tube station. It seems incredible to think anyone gets to buy a tube station, but it was sitting there. The Ministry of Defense decided they didn't need it anymore. It hadn't been actually worked as a tube station since the 30s, but it still looks like one. It's got that kind of shiny red tile frontage. It's got the platforms and the shafts, everything. He's brought in and sold the tube station. And then incredibly, 10 days, 2 weeks after this sale goes through, in fact, we didn't even make him pay the full price for the tube station, £53 million. He only had to pay a third of it under a scheme designed to encourage social housing. He got lent 2/3 of the cost by the British government to buy something from the British government. Then 2 weeks later, he is arrested in Vienna on a US arrest warrant, wanted by the FBI in Chicago on corruption charges. And it's the most astonishing demonstration of the difference in the US and UK approach to oligarchs, is that this guy made an absolute fortune in, certainly controversial circumstances, we can say that, in terms of Ukraine. We were like, get over here, what can we sell you? The Americans were like, hang on a second, and looked into him, and his business connections, which were murky. And he is, since then, that's why the tube station nothing's ever happened to it. He's never developed it. It's because he's still in Vienna 8 years later, still battling extradition, while the tube station sits there. Sold it.
And the great idea of, I can't remember the name of
the
guy.
Yeah,
there's this brilliant idea of what he wanted to do with it.
But that's really sad. There was this guy, this wonderful eccentric dreamer called Ajit Chambers, who had been a banker, who had this lovely idea to get the ghost stations, of which there are a handful of ex-tube stations in London, which are still there and just kind of closed up and abandoned to the dust and the mice, of opening them as weird kind of catacomby tourist attractions. And he did do it, this one. He had a few parties there. In fact, I know my agent went to a party there in 2013. She said it was totally wild because it had been a bomber command place in the Second World War. So it's got the kind of all the sort of maps of London's bombing infrastructure and a little mini cinema for the troops. It's all there. It would have been really evocative and amazing. But instead of doing that and having this sort of odd tourist attraction, which would have really, to be honest, enriched Knightsbridge, and Knightsbridge could do with a bit of enriching, let's be honest. Instead of that, we just have a tube station, which would have become is right next to his house. It would have been just presumably an extension of his house.
Or he bought it so someone didn't spoil the
bought it so someone else couldn't have it. But I mean, it is, it's adjoins his mansion, which has if you go there, you look at it and think, that doesn't look like much mansion, but it's actually, you can only see half of it because half of it's underground. It has a swimming pool in like the second basement.
Yes, like a lot of those properties
you
around
can
London.
Dig out the designs on the website, on the planning authority.
So the final chapter of the book is called The End ? And I always think whenever a title has a question mark in it, suggests that it's not going to be good. So without preempting your next answer, and then I want to bring in Helena, because this is the opportunity to segue to the Economic Crime Act and what are we doing about all this? There are, I should say, lots of other examples in the book. You need to buy it. Obviously, we're not going to go through every example in the book, because otherwise Oliver's publisher will be on my case.
Russell would be here for ages.
Massive spoiler alert.
Yeah,
we would be here all night. That's true. That's true. But I think when you got to the end of this journey, apart from having reread everything that P.G. Wodehouse ever wrote, which I think is fantastic in itself.
That's just the Jeeves stuff. I didn't read all. Yeah.
Right, just the canon of Jeeves. What was your conclusion about what we in the UK then are doing about all of this? How is the role of a global purveyor of corruption and misery through the provision of financial services, how is this being allowed to perpetuate? What was your when you put your pen down, shut your laptop?
I've been working on this idea for a while. It began again in Ukraine, like a lot of the things I work on, talking to friends in Ukraine about, is something best explained by corruption or incompetence? Because as things are wrong, did someone mean that to happen, or was it an accident? And I think it's a false dichotomy. There is a third option. If something it's a profitable accident, something just happens, it's not designed, it wasn't intended, but it turned out to be very profitable. Britain's butlering business, no one designed this. It didn't, but it turned out to be this profitable discovery with the euro-dollar market you need to read about, which is the most fascinating thing, which no one understands.
Sorry, just on that, I realized we might not have time, we'll come back to it, but of course, one of the reasons the euro-dollar market started was because the Russian central bank was afraid of losing its assets. What has just happened? Yeah. The Russian central bank has lost its assets.
Literally, so is that just in brackets, the euro-dollar market. So 1955, the Soviet central bank was concerned about keeping its dollars in New York because they'd be frozen, wanted to put them somewhere where they wouldn't be frozen, brought them to London, where they were used by British banks for lending out. So even in 1955, Britain was helping the Soviet Union to undermine regulations in the US, so essentially allowing our enemy to undermine regulations in our closest ally. Totally bonkers. Anyway, so what I mean is that this is deeply embedded, but not deliberately embedded, which I think is much more problematic than if it were deliberate, because there isn't a villain with a white cat, on a swivel chair to sort of defeat. It requires a total cultural change, which is going to be very hard and take absolutely ages. But I'm pretty sure Helen is going to have some thoughts on the Economic Crime Act, and I quite want to hear what they are.
I can feel her itching to say something. So for those of you who don't know Helena joined us in 7 years ago now from the National Crime Agency. So are we getting anywhere towards addressing the problem? Question mark.
Well, everyone here seems to be reflecting how they've ended up in these slightly uncomfortable bucket seats, and not that my career is particularly interesting to anyone, but it is relevant to this particular story, so I will indulge me for a moment. So I was a very committed public servant. I was going to spend my life chasing the proceeds of crime around the world. At the time where I met Tom, it was chasing drug traffickers' assets around Africa, but before that, working with colleagues who are here today, chasing them around Britain. And that was absolutely what I was going to spend my life doing. I had no intention of ever leaving public service until 2010 hit. And that's when we had the swathing cuts to law enforcement budgets that we're out, sadly all very familiar with now. And gradually, bit by bit, I couldn't do my job. I was being asked to do things, to stop bad guys doing bad things and profiting from them. But I couldn't do my job. There were no assets. There were no teams to deploy. There weren't any surveillance teams we could send out. There was no financial investigator to go and look into the case of the high level, biggest drug trafficker in Africa shipping all their heroin here and harming UK citizens. And at some point, you've just got to stop banging your head against the wall and go and find something else to do. So that's absolutely why I ended up here. And that is absolutely fundamental to why Britain is in the place it is. And I definitely categorize it as a sin of omission, particularly where we are now. As you say, there's no bad guy with a white cat stroking this and absolutely deliberately doing anything. And to some extent, it's not that ministers have really actively courted this. We've just had this hear no evil, see no evil approach to dirty money. And there's a great quote in a book by a British journalist, which you will see in my forthcoming commentary. But there's a view of, when he challenged British ministers in the Labour government, let's be clear, this what didn't set in 2010, it's been here for a long time. But when questioned about why he wasn't concerned about the floods of Russian money coming in and from former Soviet states, the view of that minister at the time was, well, get with it. This is all good money. All money's good money if it builds our schools and hospitals. Why are we questioning the wrongs of others overseas? That's nothing to do with us. And that particular view has come home to roost, I think, in the last 2 weeks. And there's been a fundamental wake-up call to the deleterious, corrosive impact of letting dirty money flood in, because let's face it, it doesn't flood in benignly. It has a real serious impact. So for those who've been watching the space, the Economic Crime Act was passed just after midnight tonight, and that comes from 3 weeks ago where we had a government minister resign because there was going to be no Economic Crime Act. So I think we should at least welcome the fact that people have woken up to the problem, but it's absolutely got to be the start and not the end. That act brings in some long overdue reforms. It brings us up to a standing start. It's absolutely not a supercharging of the efforts that we need to have. As Oliver's rightly point to, this is a huge systemic problem. These sins of omission across the whole anti-economic crime ecosystem have been around for years, and it's going to take quite a long time to unknit that. So going forward, we do have a commitment to a second economic crime bill. So it's kind of like buses, economic crime bills at the moment. They're coming along. I'd probably say we need a third, but that's coming along in the summer, we hope, and we'll look at a really important issue that has been overlooked for years, Companies House reform. It will look into some tweaks of the Proceeds of Crime Act to allow us to seize crypto assets, for example. But what it doesn't do is deal with the reason why I walked out the door of a really committed public sector career, because I couldn't do my job anymore. It doesn't overcome the resourcing issues that are kind of fundamental to this. I'm bored of saying there's no point of law if you don't enforce it, but I will say it again. But I think that conversation is one that we're now having to have in quite short order, as we've finally woken up to the fact that money has had a corrosive effect on our own economy. It's really corroding our political culture. And it's a long overdue set of reforms that are coming, but they go way beyond law. This is regulatory reform. It goes, again, to Oliver's point, to a culture. And we have seen talk, particularly in our legal community, that this is to them what the banking crisis was back in 2008. There has to be a questioning of the culture that accepted the proceeds of crime. The argument being that, the rule of law requires someone to defend some people in the courts. Well, absolutely, the rule of law is core to who we are. but there was no one asking questions about source of funds when they were doing the conveyancing for these mansions. There were no SARS going in, and there certainly weren't any cops going and knocking on doors. So, I mean, that's a long way of saying that the reason I walked out the door still hasn't been dealt with, and we're now 7 years into that. But we have to have a national conversation about what society we want to live in, because it goes way beyond simple individual crimes into having this much more corrosive impact across UK society. I'll pause there, get off my soapbox.
Yeah, there was a bit of me that hopes they don't fix it, because you might then walk back through the door and leave us. So I think you're doing a much better job here than you would back there. So just there's a few questions about the Economic Crime Act coming in. I wanted to take you back to how to abuse the Economic Crime Bill, as it then was, Act as it now is, in the press the other day. What are the loopholes? I think someone said it was icing without cake, if I remember rightly.
Okay, yeah, good line. I think, I said it was my line wasn't as good. I said it was a colander masquerading as a piece of legislation. It's Companies House is a disaster area. Any of you who don't follow Graham Barrow on Twitter or LinkedIn should do immediately. He is the sort of Companies House whisperer, and spends his life finding the most improbable examples of fraud, deeply buried, well, actually not deeply, just lying around on the surface of Companies House. And it is so rife with fraud that it's incredible. There has been a prosecution of someone for deliberately filing false information at Companies House. That person tried to create companies in politicians' names to show how easy it was to use it to commit fraud, and was prosecuted for it, which is also a demonstration of how maybe the culture is all wrong. Sadly, the Economic Crime Bill replicates all the problems of Companies House into the new offshore registry of property. So the information that it will be filed won't be checked in the same way the information that's filed at Companies House isn't checked. So you can just lie if you like. If you do go on Companies House, you can type in any combination of letters and find that someone has that name. I mean, it's improbable. I found someone the other day who was called No Name Gates. Oh no, nominee name Gates. Someone else was called No Name, address none. Anyway, that is the same system we will have with the new offshore registry. But even if you want to not lie, if you want to tell the truth, it's very easy to get out of saying who you really are. If, for example, you own your property, you're the company that owns your property equally with 4 close family members, all of you own 20% of that company. Therefore, there is no person of significant control. No one has to declare that they own it. If you own it via a nominee company, a trust company, for example, again, you don't have to declare who the person is behind it. You can just say who the trust company is. It is a disaster area, to be honest with you. I am hopeful that Economic Crime Bill 2, this time it's better, will close those loopholes. If indeed they're serious about sorting out Companies House, then hopefully they'll also be serious about creating the loopholes they've literally just closing the loopholes they've just created. It seems very odd to me that they couldn't find a way of, since they're just creating the loopholes now and they're going to close them in the summer, why not just not open them in the first place? I find that very odd. I mean, leaving aside the fact that the sanctions legislation is quite good and some of the unexplained wealth order stuff is quite important, but really the offshore registry is something that we've known. It was first promised in 2016. The bill has been sitting around since 2018. This shouldn't have been a surprise. It shouldn't be difficult, and it shouldn't have been done in a hurry.
I think it's a really good lesson in the perils of rushing through legislation. This should have come in 2 years ago, and we could have scrutinised it in the proper way through a 9-month parliamentary process rather than 1 week where I've barely slept. So,
the House of Lords, the peers in the House of Lords did quite a good job. They highlighted what the issues were, but there was no time or will to do anything about it. And I mean, the Commons just waved it through, which, yeah.
But I think it raises an important point for anyone who's interested in this topic, which is that, like, starting at 1:01 last night, we should be compiling what are the issues, and because there are plenty of people in Parliament who are supporters and advocates and sort of fellow travellers and all of this. I just think we need to, as you say, take the proper time to get the next the part 2 right.
I have spent a bit of time talking to Elise Bean, who used to work for the Senate Subcommittee of Investigations in the US when Senator Cardin was chairing it, and they always made a habit when they had an investigation of preparing a bill so that it was ready and they would present the bill and it would be ignored. But then in the late 1990s, they presented a bill on trying to close offshore loopholes, and it was ignored. And then 9/11 happened, and they needed something to go in the Patriot Act, and that's what went in.
Yeah.
So if you get something done and get an idea done and get it ready to go, then when a time like this happens, you don't rush through something full of loopholes. You rush through something that's good.
I wanted to come back to the book because there's a really important question here, and we're sitting here, and thank you for all of you who are here in person. And maybe if you're watching online, you've got two screens open, because at the moment the Foreign Affairs Committee is hearing from Catherine Belton, Tom Burgess and others about the vexatious lawsuits that they have faced. And there's a question here, which I'm just going to read. It starts off by saying congratulations on the book, so I need to relay that. Thank you, Louis, for that. Did you come across any difficulties when referencing certain individuals? When books tackle these issues, they end up being the subject of lawsuits. If so, how do you navigate these issues? And I would note that you comment at one point, you had a very interesting conversation with somebody and they said, but you can only use that if you pay me. So,
well, that was unusual. But yes. I mean, the difficulty with being a journalist writing about this is that quite often I get called up by people trying to think of clever ways to allow me to publish all the things I'm not allowed to publish. And the idea being that somehow I have a filing cabinet which is full of articles ready to go, written about, revealing the innermost secrets of whatever oligarch you name or whatever kleptocrat you name. That's not the case, because I don't even begin those investigations, because this has happened to me. It is incredibly dispiriting to spend 2 months or more on an investigation and then have it squashed and never be published. I made a film that was squashed and never published. I wrote a very long article about a sanction breaking oligarch that was never published. It's incredibly dispiriting. So the censorship works at every level because of the UK libel law. It isn't just the fact that you get taken to court, though that's stressful. It isn't just that lawyers will squash something before it gets published, though that's stressful. It isn't just that an editor will say you have to take that out, though that's stressful. It's more that I don't even start the investigations because I know there's no point. And so, we talk about needing more resources for investigating financial crime, and that's really important. But there are ways of supercharging what we already have to get more out of what we already have. And one of them is a proper anti-SLAPP law to prevent the misuse of our libel courts to really crush public interest journalism. It would be very easy to do. You could bring in essentially a public interest guillotine. A judge would be able to say, no, this story is in the public interest, bang, it's done, this goes no further. So you could still, if a footballer wanted to sue about someone revealing their private life, they could still do that. That would be totally unchanged. But if it were in public interest, if it's about misuse of power, corruption, and so on, that could just the case would stop dead, and you could carry on. No, they'd have a right to reply, whatever, and that would be the end of it. And that would unlock this. We have great journalists. It would unlock journalists' work, and that reveal a lot of things, which would produce raw material, which would then be used by law enforcement, which would produce more journalism, and it would become a virtuous circle. So along with Companies House reform, both of those measures would, without involving any more resources really from the government, would manage to unlock a lot of information which could then feed into this battle against kleptocracy, and it could be really useful. I mean, what happened to Catherine Belton? Catherine's a very old friend of mine from Moscow days, and an incredibly diligent and honourable journalist. What happened to her being sued by 4 oligarchs simultaneously, plus an oil company, is an absolute disgrace. Had she not been published by HarperCollins, Rupert Murdoch's publishers, then I feel sure her publishers would have folded. They would not have been able to take on what they did. You shouldn't have to have your own oligarch on your side in order to survive a lawsuit from oligarchs. That is not how democracy should function. Tom Burgess was also published by HarperCollins, and it's wonderful. As of, I think, yesterday, the final lawsuit brought by NRC against him was dropped, which is fantastic news, because I cannot imagine how stressful it's been for those two over there. I mean, I find just getting a letter stressful, and having that, anyway.
Yeah, no, here. So you started to skate onto some territory, which I'm going to turn to Helena first on this one, because there's a question here, which I'm going to paraphrase, but what is your opinion of the professional ethics in Britain's accountancy and legal professions? Are the standards high enough, or have they not been policed properly? So maybe let's focus on the policing point.
Absolutely. No, I think it doesn't necessarily come down to it. I don't necessarily care what their ethics are. What I do care about is that they have a risk-reward matrix in their head, which comes from a robust anti-money laundering supervision system, where they actually make a more commercial judgment that it's cheaper to comply with the money laundering regulations than not, because the cost of not doing so is too high. And that's where we've got some big reforms coming through. I know we have Treasury colleagues in the audience. The anti-money laundering supervision review is absolutely critical here. I know we've had a real focus on the law, which is important, but the regulatory side gets left behind, and we need to look fundamentally at that system. And the question for me is, do people fear anti-money laundering supervision in the legal and accountancy sectors? And the answer is no. And until they do, that culture wasn't changed. I don't care about ethics. I care about whether they wake up and think it's commercially more viable to play by the rules or not. And we saw that in play in the banking sector, particularly, these huge, robust blockbuster fines coming out of the States, not necessarily in the UK, sadly, but they fundamentally shifted the culture in the banking sector. It wasn't morals, it wasn't ethics, it was purely commercial decision and reputational risk decision. And we need that same shift to happen, but it has to come from top down. I don't think you can rely on people's own moral compass to do that, personally.
Yeah, I remember having my attitude in banking shifted by those fines and things. So but I want to keep going through a few more questions, because there's one here, I think, which Oliver would be great for you, from Mark Parker, who's one of our associate fellows. He says, does the UK government's more muscular stance on illicit finance in recent weeks represent a genuine Damascene conversion across the board, or is it simply virtue signaling, targeting only Russian wealth in response to Putin's actions in Ukraine?
I would love to believe that Boris Johnson had a sort of road to Damascus moment and realised that illicit finance, and Russian illicit finance in particular, was a great threat to the UK. But I keep going back to the moment after the Intelligence and Security Committee published its report into Russian interference in the UK. Boris Johnson sat on the report until after the general election, and then when it was finally published, and it's not a perfect report, this is not the Mueller report, but it's pretty good, and it's full of some clearly well thought out, careful suggestions and evidence from some serious individuals who've been, doing a lot of good work. And Boris Johnson rejected it as an attempt to delegitimize Brexit by Islingtonian Remainers. I did do a control F on it. It only mentions the word Brexit twice, and one of those is in a footnote. That was a shameful response to an incredibly important piece of work, which we are seeing the consequences of his failure right now. And I'm not going to forgive him or his government because they keep coming out with genuinely insane, sorry, that's rude to insane people, appalling gimmicks like the fact that they're going to rehouse Ukrainian refugees in oligarchs' houses. That isn't going to happen. That is never going to happen. We didn't even house bombed out East Enders in big houses in the West End during the Blitz. It's never going to happen now. It's just a really shameful attempt to grab headlines to make up for the fact that they've done badly. And it makes me incredibly angry, to be honest. These gimmicks, cancelling golden visas, great, fantastic. Everyone who was a problem came in, 8 years ago, they were already British citizens. What are you going to do about that? Cancelling golden visas is not enough. Creating the kleptocracy unit in the National Crime Agency. The National Crime Agency is doing really, really well, considering the very limited resources it has, as Helena laid out. But it already has an international corruption unit. What exactly is the difference between kleptocracy and international corruption? I write about kleptocracy and I don't know what semantically the difference between those two things is. These are just, it's like, when you put electricity into a dismembered frog's leg and it just jerks around. That's what I feel about these gimmicks being produced. So no, in answer to the question, I do not believe that Boris Johnson's had a Damascene conversion to fighting illicit finance. I think that he's had a Damascene conversion to a threat to his popularity and needs to do something about it. And I am genuinely concerned about the fact that our focus is on Russian money. It should be the Russian money that came here is the same money that was here a month ago. It was as bad a month ago as it is now. What would be the next crisis we have? What happens if there's a crisis over Taiwan and we suddenly look up and start thinking about what we should do with Chinese money? What happens if there's a crisis over another country? We start thinking about what we should do with their money. We shouldn't be reactive to everything all the time. We need a proactive approach to whether we want this money in the first place in this country and what it does to this country and to other countries that we accept it. So no, I have no time for them.
Right, that's pretty clear.
Helena's got thoughts. Helena's going to be more diplomatic.
As a politically neutral think tank, I'll add some balance, if I may. I mean, the one positive that's come out of the past couple of weeks is it hasn't solved economic crime for sure, no, but it has led to this national conversation about not all money is good money. It's changed that. That can no longer be the narrative coming even privately out of ministers, and this recognition of the impact on basics like rule of law and our democratic values, because that's what this goes down to, whether it's slaps or whether it's moving money into mansions. It's undermining the fabric of our democracy, and it's pretty fragile, and frankly it's not really worth trading for a few little trinkets and trickle down from kleptocrats. I think that's the big change for me. It's the shift in tone. Whether that's real or imagined, I can't say from a politically neutral think tank. Ask me in the pub later. But frankly, it's the shift in tone. I don't think we can go back from this moment to the see no evil, hear no evil response to money coming into the UK. And so I remain cautiously optimistic that the tone has changed.
I'd like to think so, but we did manage to go from the poisoning of Alexander Litvinenko to David Cameron going to Moscow to canvas for Russian money. So I'm not sure, to be honest. You know, nuclear attack in the centre of our capital 4 years later. Anyway. So.
Well, a challenge from the panel to Downing Street to prove us wrong. I guess we're almost running out of time. I haven't asked anyone for a question in the audience yet because no one's raised their hand. If you want to ask a question, please raise your hand. Olivia will bring you.
On that point, I would love to be proved wrong.
The microphone. Well, yeah,
and I'm prepared to. If Boris Johnson wants to offer me a forfeit for me to do as proven wrong, she does the right thing.
Shall we? Let's make that a joint commitment.
Yeah.
Let's make that a joint commitment.
All right, on it. Just name your forfeit, Mr. Johnson. Quadruple funding for fight against financial crime, reform Companies House, sort out the anti-money laundering regulations, and name it.
Excellent. We've got a question in the front row, sir.
Hello, is this on? Hello?
Just go for it.
Right. David Nussbaum, amongst other things, chair of the Transparency International UK Advisory Council. When I was CEO of Transparency International in Berlin many years ago, we were sued by Slobodan Milosevic for defamation on the grounds of naming him as one of the top 10 alleged embezzlers in the world in the German courts. And they have the kind of thing you referred to, that we could go to the court and argue this is so completely ridiculous, the whole case should be thrown out immediately. And that proved to be the case. Now, if this was brought in here, wouldn't there be a way of then pursuing this with the professional bodies, and in particular, the professional bodies for lawyers, and to say you have certain privileges because you're supposed to serve the public interest, public benefit. What is the public benefit of what you're doing? And clearly defending someone who's been accused of a crime, it's in the public interest that there is proper defense of a crime. But initiating action against somebody for defamation, when it's then thrown out, doesn't look like it was in the public interest. Isn't there a case for professional bodies to take more interest in the, I would say, the ethics of the members of those professional bodies, and to start raising questions about, well, are you fit to be a lawyer if your business model seems to be defending the indefensible?
It's certainly something I've been interested by in the past when I've received some of these bullying legal letters on behalf of really quite remarkable people who you don't quite understand how it's acceptable to take their money, fugitives. And it does seem extraordinary. And I don't understand why, say, the Solicitors Regulatory Authority doesn't take a more proactive approach to these things, because it is a very small number of defamation firms who are notorious for doing this. Everyone knows who they are. We none of us name them because we're terrified of them. But it does seem extraordinary that they've been able to operate in this completely free-for-all approach. And this isn't just muzzling journalism in this country. I have a friend in Angola, incredibly brave journalist called Rafael de Moraes, who throughout the Dos Santos dictatorship was regularly arrested and harassed for revealing the corruption of the government. He lost one of his most important sources of income because a British law firm tried to threaten him. He said, well, come and get me, I've got nothing for you to take. And they went after a publication that published him in South Africa, and said, if you keep publishing Rafael de Moraes, we'll take you for everything you've got. And they cut him off with nothing. So, that cut one of the really most important English language sources for finding out what was really happening in Angola. And that was done by a British law firm, taking money from questionable sources. And it really, I don't quite understand how that can happen.
So we're going to have to come to an end in a second, but I'm going to, there is a question here which I should ask. It's from an ex-police officer. And as it's a challenge, I think we should not ignore it. So it says, I'm just going to read it. Please stop suggesting that journalists are a key to allowing law enforcement to pursue complex international criminality. There are rightly robust procedures for adducing evidence, at least in the UK, and material, sometimes attained in dubious circumstances, used by many journalists, is simply not capable of being used as evidence. It is frustrating and disappointing in many instances, but this message suggests law enforcement do not wish to tackle the issue of illicit finance. The grassroots do, and they try repeatedly, and Oliver knows this. I don't think you're sitting there suggesting that law enforcement doesn't want to tackle this.
On the contrary, no. I mean,
Right.
most law enforcement agents I've spoken to, all law enforcement agents I've spoken to, just repeat what Helen is saying of being extremely frustrated by not being able to do what they want to do. I didn't mean that law enforcement agents weren't able to do something without journalists, but journalists are a source of intelligence. You know, you can read newspapers in the morning and discover things that are going on, which can inform an investigation. And it's not just law enforcement agents that do that, but in the due diligence space, in the private intelligence, they rely on media reports, and it's very important, which informs then the deals that banks do and other city organizations do. So, you know, the media is a crucial source of information for feeding into investigations, whether those are conducted by the law enforcement agencies or by private intelligence.
And I'd echo that frustration. It can be a good source, it can be paralleled. You're not going to rely on it as evidence, but you could use it as a starting point to go and use those coercive tools properly to gather the evidence. But I feel that individual's frustration, and they stuck with it, and I couldn't, and walked and came here instead. But
I think he's not in that business anymore, but we won't name him because you never know what might happen. I'm going to ask one last question because we actually have, I think, managed to go through the entire hour without mentioning the 3 words unexplained wealth order. Now, there are a bunch of questions about unexplained wealth orders, and I'm not going to try and parse them. But obviously, we know that they did not prove to be the tool that everybody hoped they might be when they were introduced in the Criminal Finances Act. We've had some changes in the Economic Crime Act passed last night. Have they now risen from the ashes? What can we expect from unexplained wealth orders? Or are we no further forward? Helen, I'll start with you.
How long have I got? Not very long. I mean, we always felt a bit like we were calling out the emperor for his new clothes when they were introduced, because they are the biggest cautionary tale of over-promising and under-delivering. They were never going to be more than a niche, what I would call a Goldilocks tool, only ever to be deployed in most limited set of circumstances where no other investigatory tool could be used. And in fact, the Code of Conduct means that officers can only use them where they can't gather that evidence through other means. Yes, it's been really important to cap the costs that law enforcement can face, because that will increase the risk appetite of going against the very people that they were intended to deal with. And we've seen, you know, high profile, I won't comment on the Baker case. It's a very complex of who really should have been advising on that case anyway, but they absolutely don't overcome the fundamental capacity issues. And I'd say even more than that, Part 5 of the proceeds of crime at the civil side is going to go absolutely nowhere near the mansions that we're all talking about in the press, the yachts, because that wealth is so commingled with illicit wealth and it's so historic, you cannot in any way link it to an unlawful activity specifically. So maybe I'll close on, and maybe we need to think about something new, and maybe Brucey, other people to think about that. But Oliver, I don't know what your thoughts are.
I'm just going to keep going back to Ukraine. Some dear friends of mine actually someone currently in Poland, but dear Ukrainian friends, they were saying after the Ukrainian revolution, a lot of money had been stolen from Ukraine, stashed in London, stashed in Switzerland, in Moscow, wherever. And I was asking them how they were going to get it back. And they said, well, to be honest, their priority wasn't really to get it back. They recognized that money was gone. There was a lot of demand to get it back, but it was going to be very, very difficult to do so. The priority was to stop any more theft. And if you could stop more theft, then you've built a dam against the problem, and you can go back and try and figure out stuff that's historic. I would really like to see the tools and measures and agencies put in place to stop more oligarch money coming into this country, buying up more of our capital in the home counties, and undermining further, as Helena made really clear, just the fabric of our society and our democracy and our economy. And then once we've done that, we can go back and try and think, do we have the tools we need to take away, you know, mansions on Eaton Square? And if we don't, then we don't. You know, we chalk that up to experience and we move on. But we can't cancel the rule of law because we're fed up with what the rule of law does. That, that's the rule of law. That's how it works. It's law. You're not supposed to be able to get everything you like from it. It is a fundamental problem if you're trying to get evidence from Russia in order to prosecute a Russian kleptocrat. That's never going to happen. That's an issue baked into the how kleptocracy works, and we need to find a way around that. But it's not taking away people's property without legal proceedings, because that's what Putin does.
Indeed, we lower ourselves to his standards. Well, look, we've come to the end of our hour. Thank you all very much for being here. Oliver, thank you so much for your time. Helena, thank you to you as well. I'm a great one for images, and actually you started going down a road there that I've been thinking about recently, which is that, sure, many of us are familiar with the fact that were it not for the dams, the Netherlands would not be there because the North Sea would swamp it. And what we have allowed in the last quarter century, indeed in the last 75 years, by failing to build or repair the dams that the UK has against dirty money, we've essentially allowed ourselves to be swamped. And were we the Netherlands, and were we not to have looked after the dams in the Netherlands, then that country wouldn't exist anymore. And I think it's a really important point to remember, which is that we have to strengthen our defenses. We have to learn when we identify these issues. And as I think Oliver's book points out very clearly, many of the tools that have led to illicit finance being sort of perpetuated by the United Kingdom were not set up for that reason. It's benign neglect which has led to that. But when we identify these problems, we must deal with them urgently and immediately, strengthen the dam. Otherwise, we find ourselves being swamped. And that is unfortunately what has happened over the last 3/4 of a century. So on that salutary note, thank you all very much for joining us here today at RUSI. Thank you all so much for joining us online, the very great number of you who took the trouble. Do immediately Amazon.co.uk or wherever you're watching in the world.
Independent booksellers.
Independent booksellers, yes, sorry, yes, quite right.
I don't.
Sorry. Anyway, this is the book, Butler to the World. It has a different cover because this is an unproofed pre-copy, which I was given. Thank you very much. Yeah, please join me in a round of applause.
Thank you.